we've heard from a couple people that are up here, so we'll kind of gloss over them. No, we have some new people joining us, though. We have Stefanie Simpson on the end, who's a coastal wetlands program manager at TNC, right? And we have Phil, I met you in Colarusso from EPA, marine biologist at EPA, and Han Chu, who has the job of the Global Warming Solutions Act implementation program manager for the Commonwealth. Sound like big shoes. Can't wait to hear. We also have Ariana joining us and Tonna-Marie again. So let's, even if we have heard from you, let's just take a minute or two, short but sweet, and tell us what your role is at your organization and how you've been interacting with Blue Carbon so far. Sure. Stefanie, you want to start?
There you go. Hi, everyone. Like you said, my name is Stefanie Simpson. I'm Coastal Wetland Program Manager for the Nature Conservancy out of the World Office. But I just started that job actually in June. Before that, I was running the Blue Carbon Program for Restore America's Estuaries. So I've been involved in the Bringing Wetlands to Market project for the past few years in supporting the development of the methodology that has been talked about, providing access for coastal wetland activities to generate carbon offsets on the voluntary carbon market. And I've also been working then to pilot that methodology and for restoration and conservation projects, which I'm doing also for TNC right now, working to connect to partners and to decision makers, promoting the importance of this additional value that coastal wetlands provide, and including coastal wetlands as part of those discussions and policy frameworks for climate mitigation and adaptation. And also bringing new partners to the table, the private sector, to support some of these projects for that climate mitigation benefit as well.
Thanks.
As I mentioned, I'm in transition. The majority of my blue carbon work was when I was at NOAA for 7 years. But I've continued to be as active as I could, and that's basically my ongoing plan. Is I would love to continue to get to work on this stuff, but it's a little up in the air right now.
We'd love to have you back at NOAA.
We were all in transition. First, I'll start with a disclaimer. Everything I say is my personal opinion and doesn't reflect EPA's official policy. So you know it's going to be good. I had the pleasure of working with Ariana on the CEC Steering Committee on Blue Carbon from 2012 to 2016. Something happened in 2016, I don't remember what, that ended that. I am actually a seagrass person, and so listening to a bunch of salt marsh talks today, I was kind of stressing. I felt desiccated, but it was good for me. And our team has been measuring carbon storage in seagrass meadows throughout New England for a number of years now. We have a manuscript that hopefully, right now we're responding to comments, and hopefully will be published soon. We have 15 different sites throughout New England we've sampled. And so that's, I think, a big data gap in this geographic area that we're trying to fill.
Hi, everyone.
We can hear you.
Okay, hi, everyone. So as program manager for the Global Warming Solutions Act for the state, I do a lot of coordination with different state agencies, such as Department of Environmental Protection, Department of Energy Resources, reaching across the Secretariat to Mass DOT, just to make sure that we plan for climate change mitigation policies to help us reach our statutory limits in 2020 and 2050. And then doing a lot of implementation tracking as well, how our policies are doing. It's been 11 years since the GWSA have been passed, and since then we have we developed the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2020 that has been updated in 2015, and then we also produced a report on how we've been implementing the GWSA in the last 10 years. That report was done last year, and our analysis shows that we are on the right track to meeting our 2020 emissions target, but there's a lot to do right now and in the upcoming years to prepare for 2050, and we're in the middle of doing a 80 by 50 study, analyzing what are the different pathways and policy options for the Commonwealth to reduce at least 80% below the 1990 levels by 2050. And then the reason I'm here is because we are very interested in how to better incorporate land use carbon into our climate action plans. In 2015, when we updated the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2020, we commissioned Apt Associates and their subcontractors to help us really look into the potential for land use, the land use sector in sequestering carbon, and then funded the development of the first generation blue carbon calculator. Dr. Tang have been updating that the past 2 years. And so as we now plan for the next Clean Energy and Climate Plan, the one that's due next year for 2030, we want to think about how can we better move this forward, incorporating land use and nature-based solutions into our climate plan. So,
Thanks. Tonna-Marie.
I'll be short. I actually wear 2 hats at the Reserve currently. I am formerly the Coastal Training Program Coordinator there, a job I loved very much. That program is a national program associated with the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. So all 29 reserves around the country have a CTP program. And that program is really focused on bringing science to decision makers in a nutshell. Connecting science with management and really trying to work at the interface of how do we ensure that science that's happening gets into the hands of people who can actually apply it to better manage coastal resources. So it's from that angle that I got involved in blue carbon work as part of the Bringing Wetlands to Market team. When we first put in the first proposal. And the idea then was to really link this whole idea of carbon storage and the nitrogen water quality issues that we were facing on Cape Cod, and has been such a big story of how local municipalities are trying to address that. And so we saw the carbon piece as being able to kind of link with the nutrient story to kind of be a double whammy in terms of getting attention of people, of how our coastal ecosystems were being degraded and how we needed to act on that. On the market side of the story, we had in mind that perhaps that could also help to incentivize coastal restoration, both wetlands restoration as well as water quality. So that was where we started the story. So my interest in the work has been with both helping to coordinate the project team and all the activities that goes with that, but also always wearing the hat of how do we engage stakeholders and decision makers and outreach to the public about what we're learning, and always that we're intentional about walking the path of collaborating with people who could use that in their work, so that we're not just doing science because it's cool, but because it can really impact change on the ground. So,
great. Okay. Why don't we start again with Stefanie? The whole discussion here is where are we going next? What do we see coming down the road? But I think we could maybe dig a little deeper into where we've been, and what we've seen so far. So we talked a lot today about a lot of projects, a lot of science and management. If you had to go through and pick the one big win, it was called today, a significant impact or advancement that you've seen, what would you pick?
That's a really great question. I wish I could talk about multiple, but in the interest of time, I will pick one, and that is over the course of the last year and a half or so, we've seen actually an uptick in climate mitigation discussions in our policy, particularly last year when the Green New Deal was dropped on the Hill. And as part of that, there's been a wonderful opportunity to make sure that wetlands are also part of that conversation, since historically they've really been left out of a lot of that. And so a really significant opportunity came when we were reached out to, when I was at Restore America's Estuaries, by staffers from Senator Booker's office and several other staff or senator and representative offices interested in, if they're going to put together a plan on natural climate solutions in the U.S., can wetlands be a part of that? And if you'll recall, actually just in the last few weeks, this past month, Senator Booker did release his version of that. I think it's called the Climate Resilience or Climate Stewardship Act. And I know all of you were right into the details of that when he released it, I'm sure. But in addition to forestry in the grasslands, there is a wetland component to that plan. And that, for me, was very, very encouraging, very hopeful to see that wetlands are included in that text, in that part of that discussion, with the hope that additional plans or future plans that come out from other offices or whoever is elected in the next year that wetlands will continue to be part of that conversation. And the science that has evolved through this project and other projects has been instrumental in allowing us to better understand what that benefit is for blue carbon, but also allows us to better communicate that so that when we do get a call from a staffer or an organization or a funder, that we can then communicate that potential to them. So that's been a really, really great impact that's happened.
Great. Ariana, you walked us through the literature at least, and your big wins in some of the scientific literature. But if you had to pick an impact or advancement, what would you?
Well, so I'm biased, of course, because I was very involved in getting coastal wetlands into the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. But to me, the fact that the U.S. responded to the request, an international request, right? We didn't have to respond to that, but we responded. We were one of only a few countries that did that. And now that coastal wetlands are in there, we have expanded our baseline to include them, and we can't really go back. So to me, that's a huge win, and it was basically possible because of all of the science and all of the outreach and communication that members of this community and the bigger community have been doing. So I see that as a huge and hopefully lasting win on which we can build.
Cool. Phil, let me guess, it involves seagrasses.
I was going to actually say the Patriots, but I'm actually going to think smaller scale. And so as part of my duties, I do regulatory work as well. And I think getting blue carbon into the discussion of permitting has been slow, but we have definitely made progress where now my colleagues at the Army Corps of Engineers, when I say blue carbon, they no longer roll their eyes. They're yet to quantify it, but that's the next step. And so I think, getting that into the decision-making process in a quantifiable way is where we need to go next. But we've started the conversation.
Great.
I'm going to go back up. I think the IPCC special report back in October of 2018 was an impetus for the administration to really open their eyes and thinking about the long-term future goals and how to incorporate nature-based solutions into our climate action plan. I think there has been an interest here and there, but it hasn't really reached a higher level until that report came out, and stakeholders have been, really pushing for us to think about net zero emissions by 2050. And so I think because of that special report, we have been now tasked with analyzing what are the different strategies in the land use sector that can get us towards net zero.
Great. Tonna-Marie.
Okay. Yes, and for me, like Stefanie, it was hard to pick one, but I'm going to do like Phil and go a little bit more local. Because when we started this work, one of the things that was really important is that the science could make a difference locally. That it needed to connect with people's work, it needed to connect with something that was meaningful to people, and how we did that. And I want to say when we started BWM1, I made a lot of phone calls to decision makers and stakeholders working in this area, and it was zero recognition about blue carbon. And so to step back 9 years later and to see some of those same people understand the term, themselves using concepts and in conversation, carbon sequestration and storage, and talking about it a lot more freely, and to kind of understand that we didn't start there. I think it's important to reflect that even though we have great places that we need to go, to take stock that this kind of relationship building and collaborative work pays dividends at the local level. And when we see a project like Herring River starting to integrate blue carbon more fully, that's in our backyard. And that's the reason we titled this conference Blue Carbon in Our Backyard, to kind of give the notion that it's something that is right in our neighborhood, that means something to our community, and that we ought to, it's valuable to the lives of people, because it's talking about how can we make our communities more resilient, how can we make the ecosystems that we depend on more healthy and wholesome for the future. And when we're talking about impact on an issue like climate change, it can get global and big very quickly, but we need to also bring it down to the scale of what's locally meaningful. And I think to see that change in both awareness, to see that change in both valuing of a benefit, and to see that change also happen in the National Estuarine Research Reserve system that we work. When we started, we were like one of a couple reserves doing blue carbon work. Now they're up to maybe, I'm estimating between half and maybe 3/4 of them doing blue carbon work nationally. That is fantastic. And so I'll stop there.
Okay. Let's make it interesting and shift up our order a little bit. So Han, how about let's shift gears in addition to our order. So that's previously looking, big wins. Looking forward, can you identify a challenge coming up, something that you see, an opportunity, sorry. Get to challenges in a minute, I'm ahead of myself. An opportunity or two that you see for implementation of blue carbon, and the stuff we've been talking about today. So coastal restoration, coastal resilience, climate mitigation adaptation.
I think a big opportunity is looking into the current state of the science, the development of tools, such as the coastal wetlands calculator that was demonstrated today. I think there's as someone, a state staff who works in climate policy planning, we're always looking at science. We're always looking at tools to help us think about what are the best strategies to put a foot forward. And so I can't identify at the moment because there's still a lot for us to scope out, but that's something that my attending the conference, Blue Carbon Conference here, and then continue to maybe plugged in with the Waquoit Research Center, that I will be able to, and we will be able to better incorporate blue carbon into our climate action plan.
Great.
So the New England governors, Governor of New York, and the 5 Eastern Canadian premiers signed a very aggressive agreement on CO2 emission reductions. As part of that, in 2017, they signed an amendment which had a clause on blue carbon management, which directed the signatories to manage and enhance their blue carbon reservoirs. So recently, I went back to the people who put that together and said, well, what exactly do you mean by this? And my attorneys warned me that you never ask a question that you don't know the answer to. And so I asked, and they said, we have no idea. We need an action plan. How would you like to write it? And you could hear crickets in my response. But being a scientist, my thought was, well, we really need to figure out what the current baseline is for the carbon stored in New England. And there are many people in this room who are, have graciously agreed to put together a group of interested parties with no funding, but lots of energy, to kind of coalesce that data from seagrasses and salt marshes for that geographic area. Our first meeting is next Monday, with colleagues also from Canada to provide data from there. So that's our next opportunity.
Great.
So we've talked a lot about co-benefits today, and one of the places I get most excited about is when there's a lot of growing attention with sea level rise on community resilience, right? How do we make communities better able along the coast to be more resilient to floods and storms, et cetera? And there is a natural pairing here with a lot of our blue carbon work, because natural wetlands, but also living shorelines and other nature-based features can potentially have a carbon benefit. So this is one of those huge opportunities I see where we can be combining, and Scott mentioned this too, that blue carbon credits that have that adaptation value are extra sexy and cool, right? But it isn't just in the carbon market. It's in everything. It's in our policies and all of our opportunities to manage these systems for resilience. There's a joint benefit there with blue carbon as well as climate adaptation that I think we could leverage far more than we have today, and I'm excited about growing that as we move forward.
Great.
So I'll say, globally, the conversation has changed a lot where we are talking about carbon more and more. We're monetizing carbon, and we may see incremental changes happening in the US as far as leadership from our government going in that direction, but that is the direction that the world is going in. We are paying attention to carbon outputs and inputs. We're quantifying this in different systems. We're figuring out ways to incentivize reductions. This is the new path forward. And so what I am really hopeful about is this enabling environment in the US that's going to allow us to continue to have wetlands as part of that conversation. We have more and more science being driven through the reserves, through agencies, through academia. We have databases being built, the Coastal Carbon Research Coordination Network being one of them, providing access to that data. We have interested states through the Climate Alliance that is saying we want to include natural climate solutions in our plans. We have private industry who are increasingly more aware and engaged, and they want to demonstrate that climate leadership to their customers. So we're seeing them reach out and have interest in those projects like coastal wetlands that can provide that climate mitigation and adaptation benefit. So as the science increases, as the interest increases, as we're looking for ways to incentivize this is really creating this wonderful enabling environment. And through projects like this, we really learn, well, what are those projects that we should be looking out to? What are those specific kind of restoration and conservation activities that we can really fine-tune and connect to these market incentives to get private industry involved, to get state involved, because there is the interest, and now we have the science to really back up that interest. So I think that's a great opportunity going forward.
Cool. Tonna-Marie.
And to continue from Stefanie, she ended by saying to have the science to back up what you're doing. And looking at the Bringing Wetlands to Market project as one example of relationships that have been built, collaborative approaches that have been used over time, that hasn't been talked about so much fully today as an individual presentation. But as I said in the morning, it's been weaved throughout everything that we've done, and I think it's part of the success and also part of the opportunity that exists for the future. And I specifically want to say that in the morning we talked about all this, the science that happens, and also the future science questions that still need to be addressed. And it's an opportunity to look at the National Estuarine Research Reserve System as a platform to support that. We have all these places like the Waquoit Bay in coastal states spread all across the nation, and they are places that are coordinating, they're well networked, they have specialists that work on research, specialists that work on land management, specialists that work on community engagement and decision maker engagement. So using those research reserve systems, places as opportunities to expand the work where we're going, and also not just on the science side, but also on the communication and on the community engagement and working with policymakers, working from the local level right up to the state and regional level, I think is really important, because we're not just trying to kind of build something from scratch here anymore. We're trying to capitalize and catalyze what we've already done and move it forward. So I think that's a huge opportunity, kind of seeing that network out there as places where we can continue to help to answer some of those research needs and continue building relationships across the nation to address some of what we've identified.
And you even got a plug for the NEARs in there, too.
Yes, had to do it.
So now, how about roadblocks? What do you see as a challenge, something that's in the way? And bonus points if you've thought about some, maybe briefly, a solution or at least an approach that we could discuss next door for an hour. Anything? How about? Okay, yeah, sure.
Phil's volunteering.
Phil's going.
Well, I'll speak for Massachusetts, and it's true for probably most of the New England states. Many of the resource management decisions are made on the local level. And so being able to, I don't want to say this undiplomatically, but distill this fairly complicated science to a level where, you know, someone who's volunteering on Concom or, you know, a local selectman can use it is a challenge. And so I've gone out and actually spoke to a number of local conservation commissions. And the way I try to approach it is, especially with coastal communities, is, you know, everyone in the coastal communities, they're worried about sea level rise. Mm-hmm. And so the analogy doesn't really carry completely true scientifically, but, you know, you tell them, look, if you're worried about sea level rise and you're dredging up all the eelgrass in your harbor, you're slitting your own throat. I realize that the amount of carbon in that meadow is inconsequential to the global cycle, but you're making the problem worse. Mm-hmm. And you have the ability to actually, you know, make the issue better. So getting the information to local decision makers is a challenge. Because of just the number of communities there are. You know, I only work 5 days a week. I can't go out and speak to, you know, hundreds of coastal communities. So getting the word out in a fashion that they can use it, I think is something we need to think about.
Yeah.
So for me, you know, Scott's presentation really resonated because I think that one of our biggest challenges is the funding piece. We have enough science to actually know that we need to do more restoration and that we need to do more protection. We don't have the money to do it is really the issue. And so for me, it's that price of carbon. How are we going to handle this? Could we have a national compliance market? Because if we could have a national compliance market with prices that were pretty steady and better than where the voluntary market is right now, you would see coastal wetland projects take off. I'm basically certain. So in terms of a challenge, it's clearly a challenge. It's not an easy thing to fix, but we do have some ideas of what that solution looks like. And the very first step is to support projects like the Herring River one, where we've got to have these solid demonstration projects that show that it can work and also show us where the weaknesses are so we can figure out how to better tackle those in the future and make projects more possible as we hopefully get to a point. I am hopeful, as Scott is, that at some point we will have that compliance market and we will have better prices and we will be ready to rock and roll.
All right, Stefanie.
Sure. You know, we've already talked, I think, a lot about, from previous speakers, about some of the science and cost. But I think those can be overcome, right? We continue to drive the science forward. We look for innovative funding sources. Right now, I'm working with Scott on a project that we're trying to move from that feasibility stage to implementation to generating carbon offsets. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest problems I have right now is that the donor, the funder that's supporting this project wants a lot more offsets than the project is actually generating, which is a very interesting problem to have. We're like, well, now we're looking, well, where else can we expand this project? Where is some other more shovel-ready, you know, restoration or ongoing restoration that we can add to this project? So we know that restoration is not happening at the pace and scale needed, and there are a lot of limiting factors there. But it's interesting that you know, kind of navigating that right now with the funders that we do have is trying to find, you know, those projects that are ready to start generating offsets and then keep those funders engaged. So not a bad problem to have, I think.
No, it's good.
I guess for me, slightly, I'll focus on the obstacles in my line of work right now for the 80 by 50 study is really translating what 80% reduction means to the average American. We want to have this roadmap to 2050 and the Clean Energy and Climate Plan to 2030 that has buy-in from not just the administration, but also everyone, because initial analysis show that we're not going to meet our 2050 emissions target if there is a huge transformation of the energy sector, and as well as tapping nature-based solutions. So right now, we're just figuring out, the analysis can tell us one thing, but how do we really get people on board to implement it? Because state can only has direct influence on certain things, and we have to really work with like communities and the federal government to really make sure that we can head towards decarbonization together. And so I don't have a solution right now. I think we are still tackling how best to communicate this, but as part of our study, we want to outline who are the actors that we need to to reach out to. What are the uncertainties in each of these areas, in municipal actions, federal actions, and state actions, and then how can we be transparent about the barriers and how we could work together to overcome them. I guess that's the only thing I can think of right now.
Well, that's great.
And I think the working together to overcome them part is really not just a throwaway statement at the end, but it's so, so, so critical. And I think that I keep having to reference the story that we're talking about today, one project story, but because it has elements that I think can be woven into the points that we're all making. And part of that, the challenge is really about sustaining that engagement and bringing the discrete pieces of knowledge together in a way that is meaningful to people. And that has to be thoughtfully done, it has to be intentionally done. It has to not just end when the project funding ends, but it has to be sustained. And I hope that the relationships that we've built through this project that has had so many spin-offs, but also other work that's going on, that's just one example, can help to do that sustaining, because I think it is going to help. We make connections, like with Han working on her project, and we connect the science with that, but we're also making connections locally. It's that tension between where the science is going, what we don't know yet, but what we know enough of to start doing something with it now. There's always going to be that tension, and that's always a challenge that we have to live with. But getting that collaborative approach where we're really intentional about working together and figuring out that if we don't do it together, we're not going to have as big an impact as we need to, because we need to bring those discrete pieces of knowledge from different entities doing their work. And I just think back, if this project were to happen, the same science questions were to happen without an intention to bringing end users and decision makers, would have great published papers, would have great inroads in the scientific literature, but we wouldn't be having the inroads in terms of what is happening locally, what is happening at the state level, and what could happen. So I think the challenge is just to sustain that beyond grant funding under the umbrella of a discrete project, and to continue to use that method in the way we work, because we have seen the fruits of it.
Great. I really appreciate that. Even though everybody was quick to, ready to come up with a challenge, nobody said, this is intractable, I'm done. It was, we're not there yet. I'm going to work on this. I know that maybe it's a scaling problem. It's communication. It's funding. It's, here's a great problem to have. It's we're not doing this fast enough. But those are really, it's encouraging for the steamrolling, right? The snowballing of this work going forward. So we have, unless anybody has any other comments or thoughts, we have some time for questions from the audience for our panel. I know it's late. I know it's after 4:30, but I'm sure somebody's been firing out. Here we got one right here.
I think this conference is excellent, and bringing everyone together is really very, very useful. And I think also what's very important, you're talking about getting the message to decision makers. Something equally or more important is getting the message to young people. So I've been working, my name is Kevin Heffernan with Mass Maritime Academy, with Jen and Kevin and Megan at USGS in getting Mass Maritime students involved in field research. And I think getting undergraduates working with you all, as well as even high school students. I've also been going out with Mass Maritime students and high school students mapping eelgrass along the southern cape of TP this summer. It's really important to get the next generation of scientists. I hear 2050, like 30 years from now, not all of us can be around. None of us will be working probably, right? But the high school students will be. They'll be in our seats. They'll be doing the research. So it's really critical to engage students, high school students and undergraduates in research. So I strongly suggest that you continue doing that. These conferences are wonderful, but the next generation is going to be leading it, because people who are decision makers now really have dropped the ball to some degree, or won't be around 10 or 20 years from now. The next generation is what you need to grab. So this is wonderful. Thank you for inviting us.
Chris, can
Any
I
thoughts?
just
On the
just one quick
communications?
thing, because this is so important. You may have stopped by the table outside where you could see our educators from the reserve having materials there that talk about bringing wetlands to market curriculum that was expressly designed to bring the science that we're learning right now into the classrooms and to make it as realistic as possible for the teachers in terms of the science that they're working with. So they're actually using Omar's model that you talked about this morning. They're using field data from the team. They're working with that. There's a curriculum that has been designed and materials developed and lesson plans, and that's all available on our website, because you're absolutely correct. And that has also been transferred to other reserves around the country, so it's not just happening in Massachusetts. And the only reason we didn't have a presentation about it today is because it's September 10th and teachers are not here to hear about it, so we wanted to just know our audience. But we do want, it's not because it was any less important than any of the subject matter that we covered today, but that curriculum is there. A lot of work has gone into it, and Joan Muller, our education coordinator, is back there. Give a wave, Joan. You can talk to people about it afterwards. And also, a lot of the material that was developed for the teachers is also very, very useful for just anybody trying to understand the issue. So it's not just, oh, that's for high school kids. I mean, they were really thoughtful with the activities. It helps anybody's learning about the subject matter.
Are those resources online?
Yes.
Okay.
From the Reserve website?
From the Reserve website. Yeah.
Awesome. Maybe could you send it out to all the participants afterwards?
Yes, we will.
That'd be awesome.
Any other thoughts, questions? Yeah.
My name is Tom Dignas from Microbiology Press at Queens College, out of state. But I have a quick comment. I need some verification, and then I think I have a question for you, Stefanie. First of all, the comment is I'm really pleased to see someone from Nature Conservancy in this kind of a setting. I've never seen it before. I mean, you guys do a great job. 190 million acres preserved, protected, however we want to say it. And you have tremendous clout in industry connections. You had that for probably 35 of your last 65 years of existence. The other thing I like about it, I want to make sure it's still the case, is I think part of the way you can leverage, the way you've been successful leveraging with the industrial community, is that you speak there in their terms. When push comes to shove, you say, this property is unique enough for us to buy it. We will pay for it. And we are asking you and our contributors for the money to do that, to provide that protection. It looks to me, now here's the question, it looks to me now, with the kind of program that you appear to be heading up, that you may be opening up a total new niche for their kinds of purchases, in that it may be not particularly unique properties anymore. It's just properties that are valuable as maybe part of a bigger parcel to move a project ahead. We heard some intimations of where the problems may be with the Harry River. We got some private landowners that have to become stakeholders. Well, that's really hard to do, I think, having done some of this kind of stuff in my life. And it still is the case, I think, that when push comes to shove, unless you're going to use eminent domain, which I hope we never have to come to in the Harry River, money talks. So is that something, is that a role that you could see developing in addition to carbon sales, a great approach? Is that another avenue that you could see that could help leverage big pieces for carbon, for blue carbon, that would be different from the historical mission of the Nature Conservancy? You know, just not ruffle grouse, a parcel here out in the Great Plains, and we've got 80 acres of it, or something, you know. Non-unique properties, but pieces that are integral to fit into a very big and much more significant project. Is it different? Do you see it as possibly a different kind of approach for the Nature Conservancy? That was very long, and I'm sorry.
That's right. I'll try to answer your questions. You'll have to let me know if I bounce around it too much. So I will, I'm new to the Nature Conservancy the last couple of months. This is something, as far as blue carbon, that the Conservancy is building within our programmings. So my particular role is to support our state and country programs to lead on blue carbon efforts as it fits within their programming. That's kind of two different ways I see that. Is one way in the U.S. where the restoration potential is higher. We have a lot of our lands that are already locked up or owned, managed by state, federal agencies, and the rest is kind of developed, really, or under protected easements. So we're hoping really to use carbon markets as a way to help incentivize and move forward restoration in the U.S. Globally, there's a larger potential for conservation. So we're working with countries who a lot of the coastal areas are privately owned. And then how can we work with those landowners to just protect their existing coastal wetlands? And then another avenue that I am working on is in resilience. We're developing a resilience methodology. So similar to carbon offsets, quantifying the flood reduction benefit of coastal wetlands. Can we use that separately? Can we use that in tandem with the carbon benefit to help kind of to quantify more of this landscape scale approach to restoring and saving and protecting these ecosystems? It's not just the salt marsh, it's also the oyster beds and the coral reefs and all of this that helps reduce flooding in certain areas. So that's part of my portfolio. There is a lot of different approaches that the Conservancy is currently using as far as conservation finance, including debt swaps with especially like developing countries, and working with local governments and national governments to include coastal wetlands in their nationally determined contributions, like say for the Paris Agreement. So there's a lot of different approaches. I don't know if I answered your question or not.
Well, I think you did. It sounds like there are a lot of new approaches that the Conservancy wants to pursue, and I think it's great. It does sound a little different from the yearly newsletters I get. They just say, we've acquired this acreage, and this is what we're doing with it. And we've got this over here, and we got that over there, and they just buy it. And I have to admit, there's a part of me that really likes that. It's just stop screwing around and get the money and buy it.
Yes. That's still part of the mission. That's still part of it.
Can I just add that? Sure. So I was previously with the Maryland, D.C. chapter, and interestingly, the Nature Conservancy was so successful for those first 30-some years at continuing to acquire those really unique properties. But the Nature Conservancy has also made a commitment that they will manage each of those in compliance with the Land Trust Alliance land management standards. Well, that takes people and resources to properly manage that land. So one of the things that has happened is almost like a forced transition in terms of everyone suddenly realized we can't just keep acquiring properties because then we have to have people to manage those properties, and that's an exponential model that is not sustainable even if there's growing interest in more donors, et cetera. So there is a shift going on where yes, there's still some property acquiring, but it isn't the only focus anymore just because it couldn't stay that way. They were so successful for a while that then it became, well, we just can't keep doing exactly just that. And it was a very interesting conversation within my chapter of when do we think about the acquiring versus other tactics for thinking about preservation and conservation. It's fascinating, right? I mean, it's like being so successful that now we have to change our model. It's really interesting.
We have a few more minutes. Any other thoughts, questions? It's getting late. It must be 4:45, right? All right. Well, yeah. Okay, Kevin. Oh, killing me, man. No, just jokes. Go ahead.
Bring us home, Kevin.
Sorry. I just wanted to ask Han. You mentioned that the state is analyzing the potential pathways for reaching net zero emissions. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what's involved in that analysis. And over what time frame it's going to occur, and what the outcome is going to be. Is this something that's going to be available? Is there communication with other states who are engaged in that kind of exploration as well?
Sure, yeah. Well, just to tackle your last tidbits first. So yeah, we are part of the U.S. Climate Alliance, and we've been very active in their different work streams. one of which is deep decarbonization webinars, where they talk about like ways different states can produce a decarbonized study. So that has been helpful, giving us some lessons learned from other states and some synthesis of studies that have been happening. But our 80 by 50 study has been, I guess, happening in parallel to that. We scoped out the work last year, and then we finally get the RFR out in the spring, and then have hired consultants the beginning of this summer. And so the intention is to have the study continue all the way until the end of next year. Because next year we have the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2030 is due. It's a statutory requirement. The Secretary will also have to set a 2030 emissions limit. By the end of next year, is gross emissions. But again, you know, Secretary Thea Harady, she's very interested in going beyond gross emissions and thinking about, well, what are the net emissions? And so this study here, we will explore different strategies and active management practices that can help us approach net zero. In terms of the technical analysis, it's being done by the CADMIS team, who have hired Dr. Jonathan Thompson from Harvard Forest to do the land use analysis, and he's a forester, and so there is a lot of heavy emphasis in the study on forestry and their impact, their role in sequestering carbon. He is open to incorporating agricultural lands and soil carbon on agricultural lands, and also on wetlands. That's not his forte, and so we're exploring how best can we incorporate that in there. And we do have a conversation scheduled with some members of the TNC, Steve Long and Laura Marks, forest ecologist. They've been part of this advisory implementation advisory committee for the GWSA, and they've been very involved in, you know, all the analysis that we have done thus far in this realm for state planning purposes. And so perhaps they can help us figure out like how to complement Dr. Thompson's forestry background with agricultural land analysis as well as wetlands, and maybe we could even tap the BW1T. Exactly. Yes. So the study, we should have a online portal out soon in the next month or so. We would like to work some internal things out first with our team. We just got started, so forthcoming.
Would that be something you'd be willing to share with the group as well?
Sure, yeah, definitely.
Materials?
Yeah, I'll definitely send, once it's ready, I'll send it to Tonna-Marie, and then she can send it out to everyone.
Cut. One more? It's okay if we're done. It's 4:45. So would you join me in thanking our distinguished panel here for the discussion?